being here.
Hi, Shireen. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, we're recording and we are live. So Cletra, right at 7, you can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of San Mateo County Juneteenth 2022. I'm Cletra Newton, she, her pronouns, and I will be your moderator for the evening. We continue the conversation to increase awareness about the history and present day significance of Juneteenth, focusing tonight on the topic of education as it relates to Black people, people of color, and living free. Joining the conversation this evening are San Mateo County educators, thought leaders, and our esteemed panelists. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes that I want to make you aware of. This webinar will be recorded. Recordings will be available on the County Juneteenth webpage. Webinar attendees can interact with staff running the webinar through the chat function for technical questions. Attendees will not be able to chat with other attendees. Attendees can use the Q&A feature, and panelists will answer questions after moderator questions. Live transcript is available through Zoom, and additional resources will be shared at the end of the webinar. Surveys will be available at the end of the webinar series to gather feedback and ideas for next year's Juneteenth events. Tonight, our panelists are Dr. Jamila Moore, she, her pronouns, Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management at San Francisco State University. Thank you for being here, Jamila, welcome. We have Niambi Clay, she, her pronouns, Executive Director of Equity, Social Justice, and Inclusion for San Mateo County Office of Education. Thank you for being here, Niambi. And we have Marissa McGee, she, her pronouns, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator for Ravenswood City School District and Menlo Park City School District. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. When we think about Black people being enslaved for generations, and then Black people were freed, mostly, except for those who didn't learn of their freedom until 2 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. We learn about Special Field Order number 15, which promised 40 acres of land to formerly enslaved people, but that promise was quickly rescinded and not fulfilled, impacting land and housing ownership for Black people even now. We learn about anti-literacy laws that made it illegal for enslaved people of color to learn, to read or write, and prohibited anyone from teaching people of color to read or write. We recall the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, made famous by Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court ruled that separating children in public schools based on race was unconstitutional, though segregation still existed for years after the ruling, and sometimes, unfortunately, at the private level today. We realize that freed Black people and people of color have a storied, deliberate history regarding education in the United States, and we will continue to explore this history in the US and in San Mateo County in particular. Let's start the conversation with you, Niambi. How do you see education relating to the Juneteenth holiday that we are commemorating?
I'm excited that Juneteenth is now a federal holiday because I think it does highlight and bring it to the surface for students and adults alike. So when I say education, I don't think it's just students. I think adults have a lot to learn as well. But education is the way that we make sense of the world. It's the way we make sense of ourselves. And so Juneteenth is really time where African Americans, Black folks can tell about their stories and their histories from their own perspective. So I think that, first of all, is a really important key point. Oftentimes our stories are told from others' perspectives. And so it's not told the way you're going to want it to be told. It doesn't reflect how you feel or what your experiences are. And also, I'll say, in this country, Black folks are often portrayed as less than human or subhuman. And so this Juneteenth is another opportunity just to affirm our own humanity through kind of our rituals and our stories and our histories. And so I do think that is important, something we have to keep doing. It's, it's behind Black Lives Matter. It's really just saying we matter, we're human too. And it's an atrocity that we have to continue to say that. But I do think it is a time to do that. I also think Juneteenth is important as a moment in time, but I think it's really important, just all those things you just talked about in terms of understanding context. And so as we continue to celebrate Juneteenth and the broader population continues to commemorate Juneteenth, it is important for us to recognize that there's a lot of context around Juneteenth. It's not just a moment in time, but understanding kind of the violent environment that these folks had to endure, before and after Juneteenth, or after the announcement, I should say. I also, in doing my own research on Juneteenth, I was excited to learn other things about Juneteenth. And so I think right now it has become kind of this heroic tale of this Union, general that rolls in and it makes this announcement with his almost 2,000 troops.
Mhm.
But what folks don't know, a lot of people, and what I learned in my research was that actually there were about almost 10,000 Black soldiers that actually showed up at the same time. So you had 28th Indiana, 29th Illinois, you had two regiments from New York. Don't know why, but all these folks actually showed up at the same time. And so to me, even that image of, yes, you have almost 2,000 white soldiers saying you're free, but you also look around and you see almost 10,000 Black military folks who are free and who also showed up at the same time. And I think context like that is important to understand that that's a very important visual for folks who are newly freed. So the last thing I'll say about, I think there's lots of reasons, but the final one that I'll express right now is I think it is important for students to understand that there is this pattern or this thing that happens when you want to establish equality for all people. And there's oftentimes a very quick backlash to that and all of these things put in place. And I think Juneteenth is an example of that for students to learn about. They're going to be the ones that continue this fight and help us really try to establish equality for all people. So understanding and expecting and kind of anticipating for this backlash and addressing it, it will be really important as we go forward because it's going to continue to happen.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate the fact that you took the time to offer some education and really explaining your perspective around the question. And, you know, again, offering people an opportunity to do their own research and education to understand that Juneteenth, while it is celebrated and it is commemorated, it's much more than festivals and face painting and hot dogs, as I often say on different panels. And there's so much history around, excuse me, how it actually came together in terms of the commemoration and why it was so important. So again, thank you for that explanation and providing us with insight. Marissa, I'd like to ask you now, why do you think education is central to the conversation about Black freedom in the United States and freedom for all, as Niambi just mentioned? Because again, you had freed slaves who actually participated in some of these historic events that people are now only learning about. So when we speak about liberty and justice for all and Freedom Day, what are we really talking about? How is education central to that conversation in a way that perhaps we've not discussed before?
That's a great question. And I want to go back first to a word that Niambi used, which was commemorate. And I think that just encompasses showing respect and celebrating history and making sure that we're doing both. And so now to go back to your question, I think the first step with education is to first acknowledge, and I think we really need to acknowledge the prevalence of anti-Blackness in this, I would say, this city, in this country, but really it's pretty much worldwide, I would say. I think that's an integral piece of it, because we can't move forward and we can't say that we truly want freedom for all if we have this looming in the background. So I think that's the first step. And then the other piece is also going back to what Niambi said, which is this danger of a single narrative and really considering whose perspective is being told. And so making sure that we're incorporating multiple perspectives so that people are being seen and so that everyone can engage in perspective taking. And so I think those are two key pieces when we're thinking about what does Black freedom mean and what does freedom mean for everyone. And I think some of that pushback that was alluded to earlier, for some reason, people think that freedom is like a scarce resource, and it's really not. And so if one person is free, then there can truly be freedom for all, and it's not a resource that we have to compete over. So I think just being prepared for that piece of the pushback and being ready for that conversation is something that's really important, and recognizing that if there is truly freedom for Black people, that can affect everyone. Especially, I mean, this is my own bias coming out, but just especially thinking about the magic that is Black people. So I think those are some important things to think about when we're thinking about what freedom means for everyone.
Let me ask you a question based on something that you just mentioned, which I think is so important. So if we're talking about education being central to the conversation, and we're going to get into current conditions of education, how that's playing out today, and how specifically it relates to freedom. But if we're talking about those educational challenges, which essentially is what this entire conversation is about as it pertains to Black people, how does one then have a defined perspective, and how do they learn to articulate their perspective if they are part of those that have been challenged with education as it pertains to understanding freedom in Juneteenth?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think for starters, it comes with doing some inner work, some of that mirror work, and really taking time to reflect and do your own research. And like Niambi said, she learned some new facts. And I think that's one step, is first doing that own work yourself. And that way you can be prepared to have these conversations and prepared for the steps that come next. And then I think it's also just in doing that inner work, sometimes it can be uncomfortable or cause some discomfort when you're acknowledging perhaps your own role in the systems that have been created. Because to some point, I'm sure there are a lot of people who can say they're complicit in these systems that have been created. So I think sitting with that discomfort is an important step as well.
Thank you for that. Jamila, I'd like to turn to you now. We do understand that many of us, some of us call it into question, many of us have an acute understanding about systems that have been designed, historical and present day, to keep Black people and people of color in general challenged in the area of education. It's certainly not to highlight any one particular area or point the finger at a group, but we do know that there are policies, legislation, practices, and a host of other things, again, past and present, that call for challenge of education to Black people. So when we think about that fact, how does education historically impact Black people in San Mateo County, and what are the current conditions?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Cletra, and be a part of this conversation. It's so very important. I think in looking at that question, or downloading on that question, as I would say, is, California is always kind of at the forefront of innovation and economic success. And as the state is one of the most diverse in the union, California has also been a place of opportunity and challenge for Black Californians. However, through racist policies and inadequate public funding to schools attended by predominantly Black Californians, ensuring that too many Black Californians lacked access to high quality schools and college preparation, and contributing to generations of poverty and mass incarceration and limited social mobility. It seems as though we continue to start at the start line, or in this conversation, always a few steps back because of what has been put in place, whether it's statutorily, historically. So, historically, the school experiences for Black students in San Mateo County continue to be substantially separate and unequal. And most Californians often forget that as late as the 1960s, Black students were educated in wholly segregated schools, funded at rates many times lower than those serving whites, and were excluded from many higher education institutions entirely. And so the end of legal segregation, followed by efforts to equalize spending since 1970, has made some improvements, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So when we look at education in San Mateo County, it's not immune to this state and national historical inequity and what has happened in this country for centuries. So when we fast forward and look at maybe in the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, institutions need to kind of foster change that enables communities and schools within San Mateo County to provide an equitable experience to Black students. So while this has always been important, it becomes criticalness, as has been exposed by today's dual pandemics. As we have this conversation, we have the pandemic of COVID-19 that has added to this situation, that has disproportionately impacted Black communities. And then we have the pandemic of what my colleagues have also mentioned already, anti-Blackness, that has a unique strain of devaluing and criminalizing Black lives and minds. And we still have a long journey ahead on the road to achieving racial justice. So I think we have to put it front and center that, Black students matter, but Black lives matter. And so as we have this conversation, we have to look at the history because it continues to repeat itself because we have not made the real change, because we're not seen as being equitable at the table in having access to resources, in having access to economic opportunities that will allow us to really be able to take advantage and be able to participate as fully whole individuals at the same level as our other counterparts who have a generational wealth, who have access to things with regards to education, careers, that we seem to still kind of be struggling for some of the basics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So powerful. Thank you for that. I really am curious to hear from all of you about what's missing from the conversation. So for the people who are at the table, and some of us are certainly in the room in this day and age and at the table, but very few. The conversation that's happening at the table, what's missing from the conversation today? And that's a question for all of you, please.
So in my opinion, I'm not 2 years into this role, and it is a new role for San Mateo County Office of Ed. But so one thing that is missing, I don't know if it's missing, if that's the word, but that I see is kind of the invisibility of Black students here in San Mateo County. And so, we do this disaggregation of data and want to look at these different groups, but our numbers are small and spread out. And so you hear phrases like, insignificant, statistically insignificant. And it's like, no, these are students. These are our babies. They're not insignificant. And so for me, that is a thing that I would like to focus on and change, is this kind of narrative around Black students being invisible or not rising. I mean, we see the data says, they are suffering, they need help, they need support, but yet the numbers are small. So it's like, oh, well, we don't have to focus on that. And so really trying to change that narrative, I think specifically for San Mateo County, is important.
I would add to that, I think Nyambi is on point, is the ability to be seen and therefore to be heard. And let me give you some examples, because I don't care how old you are. I mean, there are about 2.8% of Blacks in San Mateo County. That's not a large number. And so we find ourselves in what I call unicorn spaces, where we are one of two or one of three or the only one. And so if you don't know how to navigate and articulate and advocate for yourself, we find situations of a common pattern. Dr. Tyrone Howard, who is an educator at UCLA, makes a great point. He says, our students need someone who can be in the room for them so that they can be seen and therefore they can be heard. We have situations where teachers or folks in education simply do not see or recognize Black students and how we interact or how we communicate. And we find that we become spokespeople because students come forward on what they can't get, and they don't know how to advocate that process. And we've been taught to be seen somewhat, but to also not be loud or not be expressive. So I'll give you a very specific example. We had a situation where there was a teacher, it was a kindergarten classroom. We talk about our babies who are getting expelled in kindergarten and in first grade. I don't know what you have to do to get expelled in kindergarten, but I don't know if I would have made it in this day and age. So what is happening is that what is being portrayed about how Blacks are being seen as aggressive or as being less than human or as being something to be feared makes its way into our society, makes its way into our classrooms. So you have a student, and he may be one or two of a Black student in a classroom. The kids are all jumping around, but the teacher's only going to point out or identify the Black student. And then all of a sudden, the Black student doesn't know how to really advocate. Well, why am I being singled out? So we find and we see these small microaggressions that make their way through different segments, through different situations and their actions. And, these students may not know how to advocate that, I was standing there, or I didn't know how to say this, or I was told that I was the one that was wrong, but everybody was jumping up. Or you have what I call the asking, do you want to participate? If you're going to ask the kindergartner, do you want to come learn your numbers? And they say no. It's not fair for you to turn around and say to the parents on parent night, your child doesn't want to learn. You're asking, and most kids at that age are going to choose to make their own decisions. So it's a cultural thing sometimes that's taking place too, and helping our students advocate, and our parents also have those conversations so that they can be seen and can be heard, so they can get what they need.
And I would just say, building on both of these answers, a lot of times we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we leave out belonging. And I think that's a critical piece. And part of figuring out where that fits into the mix or how to support that sense of belonging is, I think it includes talking to people whose voices have been historically marginalized, and that's families. I think that's students. Like, how often do we sit down and just talk to a student? I had one recently who told me that I think I asked the question of like, how often do you feel you can show up as your authentic self? And her answer was once a week when she was in a certain club. And it's just like, how disheartening is that to feel like you can't show up as who you are? So I think what's missing is the voices of the people who are in front of us, like talking to families, talking to students. And I think that's a critical piece in this whole conversation.
Thank you both. Thank you all, rather, for contributing to that answer. And Marissa, I'm going to stay with you for a minute because this brings me to my next question, specifically around your comment with belonging. So why is it important for children of color to see themselves in academic settings, especially in higher education? Certainly in different schools and academic institutions, as Jamila mentioned, you may have one teacher or two educators depending on your race or ethnicity. And that's helpful, but it's not enough. So let's talk about the importance of seeing yourself in academic settings and being represented, that belonging that you mentioned.
I think there are so many reasons why it's important, but one is going back to that sense of belonging and just feeling like you can show up as who you truly are and not have to mold yourself to fit in with the larger group. I think something else is going back to not having to be the only one. Oftentimes when you're one of two people or the only person in the room, it can be challenging because it feels like you're often called on to be a teacher when certain things come up and you don't have the privilege of actually being a learner and taking that stance. So I think that's one of the many reasons why it's important. And I think it's just really affirming to see yourself, thinking about curriculum, thinking about peers, thinking about teachers, thinking about books that are in front of you. Like, how amazing is it to pick up something and see a reflection of yourself in that? And oftentimes I feel like that's something that's missing for Black children, and just thinking about or wondering what impact does that have on them? Thinking about things like stereotype threat or just the different perspectives that they're taking and not seeing a perspective that resembles theirs. So I think the list could go on, but those are some of the main reasons why I think it's so important. Representation does matter if we're using hashtags right now.
Yeah, there you go. Hashtag absolutely representation matters. Would anyone else care to join in and contribute to that question?
I wanted to just add, I totally agree with everything Marissa said. And I also think it's important not to be considered that anomaly or unicorn. In my previous work, worked around the country to help desegregate schools. So we were adding students of color, low-income students to AP and IB classes. And, you talked about Brown versus Board, but if you go around our country is highly segregated. If you go within the school walls, it's highly segregated. One school I was in, I had to point out to the principal, I was like, do you notice that all of your white teachers and your white students are on the second floor and all of your Black teachers and your Black students? And she was like, really? I hadn't noticed. I don't know if she hadn't noticed. I don't know that I believe her, but just the fact that you could have it set up like that, and I can walk into your school and see that, but it is around a lot. But what I would get sometimes when I would go out and, work with these districts is we're looking for people like Niambi, like we want the one, and it's like, nope, you're just looking for good students who want to do this. It's not this one person that you're looking for. And I think that often happens to us if there's not. And so that is one strategy that we would encourage is like, no, we're going to move a whole cohort of students into these classes. You will see that all of these students can do it. It is not the one or two that you have self-selected to say that your numbers have gone up, but we're going to move a bunch. And so I do think it's important for that belonging piece to think about how you are moving groups of students or how they have that support and they can see around them and have students around them that look like them, as well as teachers that look like them.
Absolutely.
I agree with what the panel has said.
Yeah.
I would only add, this work is not easy. I think, in looking at some of the numbers, I'm happy to say that 88% of Black 19-year-olds in California have a high school diploma. The challenge is that once they decide to go to college and get to college, about 60% of Black high school graduates are not prepared by their high schools to meet the A through G course requirements for admissions to UC and CSU. So, showing up and they've done everything they're supposed to do, then they find there are continued barriers. And so working through those barriers, they need a lot of support to make sure that they're getting everything that they need so that they can be successful. I think the challenge that we will continue to have is that while Brown versus Board of Education was great, I think my colleagues are correct. There's still a lot of segregation because Brown versus Board was trying to desegregate the schools. We should have looked at also desegregating neighborhoods so that people could learn about one another and live next to one another and begin to build and grow relationships, because a lot of these neighborhoods remain segregated. And so the ongoing challenge of true equity and integration continues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk for a second about being a unicorn and being a Black person or a person of color, right? This has been going on forever, for ages, for generations, whether you were in, advanced courses, historically, and I'm dating myself with this, but particularly in California, it was GATE. And you have all of these courses where there were a lot of Black students who would have absolutely qualified if they had the nurturing and had someone to coach them and create that sense of belonging. But we go through cycles, and I'd like for you all to talk about this, where it's not cool to be the unicorn. It's not cool to be the smart kid. It's not cool to be the person who understands and is able to possibly navigate outside of their neighborhood or their environment for a better education. And I see a bit of that changing now, but perhaps not at the rate that it should be. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Can you tell us about if those numbers are in fact changing, if that cycle is breaking, if it is suddenly becoming okay to be your authentic self and still be gifted, if you will? Anyone?
I'll start.
I see you all smiling, so I'm waiting on this great comment here.
Well, I had the benefit, I will say, of going to a mostly Black elementary school in West Oakland. And so I feel like there with Black teachers, it was kind of like we could all be smart and have fun. And so it wasn't a stigma there. And so I feel like when I went to middle school, which was, had everybody, was much more diverse, that's where I began to see kind of the stigma of, oh, you're in these classes versus other classes. But again, it's because we didn't have a bunch of us, we weren't in community there. So I felt like having that community in elementary school made a huge difference on how they influenced us around that. I don't know that it's different. I would like to say that it's different now, that I've seen examples of students who feel like it's cool to be a nerd and it's okay. But I don't know about that like countrywide. So I don't know, I would leave that part up to someone else. But I have seen examples of where it's okay and they actually embrace it as a new way of, not a new way, but another way. This is also Black, this is also okay. We're all different, but I'm smart too, and it's okay, so.
Yeah.
I went to school in San Mateo County. My mom taught here, and I'm thinking back when you said you're dating yourself. I was like, oh, I remember Gates. And, I'm just gonna say I'm 25 today. Just kidding.
Fantastic. Let's do it. We're all 25 today.
But I can recall taking, I think we had to take like a math test in 8th grade, and the students who scored the highest were then bused, or not bused, we were taken in a van to a high school in a neighboring area because our school didn't offer Algebra 1. And I can remember being called certain names because there was this idea that achievement was synonymous with a certain race. And so I can't say for certain that it's changed, but I do think there's progress in the sense of when we think about what it means to be Black, like there are so many layers and we're multifaceted and it can mean so many things. So with that, I can only hope that we're starting to see like, oh, achievement isn't restricted to one group of people. Like we all bring different things to the table. So I'm going to go with that, go the optimistic route right now.
Well, I'm gonna go the opposite route because I don't think it's changed. And I'm Marissa, I applaud you, girl. Look, I want to be with you, but the data just isn't there. So, I don't know if folks may remember, but back in January of 2013, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of San Francisco Bay Area released a report called Held Back. And in that report, it talked about how Black and Latinx students were being asked to repeat Algebra 1. And so when you used your example, Marissa, which I think is an excellent example, I was like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be, but that's not how we're doing it. And so they found that in school districts, certain school districts, and this is where predominantly students of color were, if they had taken algebra in 8th grade, they would still go to high school and other places, and they would still make them repeat Algebra 1 in grade 9. And when somebody pointed that out and said, hey, I've already taken this, their word was not, and their evidence was discredited. And then somebody went and they did a study, and it was the Silicon Valley Foundation who sponsored the study. And they found that, you know what? They're doing this to students of color. And they titled that report Held Back, and they showed that data. And I don't know about you, but 2013, 2014 wasn't that long ago. So I believe it is definitely still happening. But if we don't have folks who can stand up, who can advocate, and people who are willing to do the work with regards to data, meaning that we have to look at the data. I want to believe that it is better, but the data tends to tell me that we still have work to do. So those students starting Algebra 1 again in 9th grade, it prolonged their ability to get on, to remain in the college path on their math courses in their A through G once they got to high school through no fault of their own.
Jamila, I hear you and I agree with you. The distinction to me, I guess, from Cleatra's question is around, is there a stigma with other students? Because that also happened to me in high school, like only one of 2 Black kids in AP in a high school that's 40% Black. So it's like, that's ridiculous. But in terms of student stigma, that wasn't there, but there were definitely adults that put several barriers in place and would not promote you. But I'm hoping like the student peer stigma, I guess I should say, is getting better. But I think the adults, that's where I see most of the barriers, like the adults putting these barriers in place in terms of structures, in terms of mindsets, in terms of who you're recommending. So that's the piece that I really think we need to work on.
The biases, Niambi, that you speak about with regards to adults, is longstanding without question. And that's really the reason that conversations like this hosted by San Mateo County are important, because there are these conversations happening in silos and certainly industry specific, but I don't know that there's been a lot of public conversation, certainly around Black people and freedom, if you will, as an overall narrative that speaks to some of the challenges that we're talking about tonight. So I do think this is a critical conversation that we're having. And I have to be optimistic Marissa, in thinking that these conversations do start to create some level of community and belonging. If nothing else, if people are talking about it tomorrow on another Zoom meeting, perhaps, or in the workplace, or really just starting to think about the longstanding history. Because again, we started this conversation with a timeline that began in the 1800s. We're now talking about things that are happening right now. And this, a lot of what you all have shared and the setbacks and the barriers that we still face feel very strategic. And when you're dealing with adults learn over a period of time how to perpetuate. And that's what I hear a lot of what's happening yet today. So with that in mind, how do you think we should be addressing education to ensure that Black people are able to reach their full potential in San Mateo County? I don't know if education is the ticket to reaching your full potential in San Mateo County or any county for that matter, but specific to the conversation we're having tonight, what are your thoughts around that? Nyambi, I'd like to start with you.
For me, I think it starts with actually hearing those perspectives, hearing those stories, hearing those lived experiences, because I think it's hard to address what you think the issue is without actually talking to the people that are encountering the issue. So I think that's number one, is like, how do we bring into the fold, bring into the conversation the people that are most impacted, which are going to be the Black students here in San Mateo County. I think there also need to be ways, that invisibility piece really bothers me. So I think there also needs to be ways to really bring our stories to the forefront so people can understand and know. I think, and then listening to Jamila, that there's some pieces that I think are very challenging, but that housing piece and kind of where people have been relegated to live really impacts education and which district you're in. And I get all kinds of calls about, I live in this city, but I should be in this district because my house should be over here. So it's just, these things are very tied together. So I also think in addressing education, we do have to address some other things as well. And I know that makes it more complicated, but they are so tied together that it is hard to address one and really have the impact that you need without addressing multiple things. But I do think it starts with listening to our students, to our families, what their experience is, what their barriers are, how do we address those?
I do think it's complex, but I don't think it's as complicated as people in power and authority would have us believe. I think it's more specific to understanding the strategy, right?
Yeah.
And knowing that there is a strategy to something as simple as talking about the history of Juneteenth, talking about housing, speaking about redlining, that punts over to education, right? Because to your very point, if I live in a particular place, then I'm cast out of a particular district, that might give my student an opportunity to have better or more informed education. So again, I think their strategy that creates the complexity more than the situation itself being just horribly complex. But Jamila, please chime in.
I agree, and I agree with what Nyambi is saying. I think that, it is strategy and knowledge is power. People utilize and they weaponize information. If you have the right information, you know what to do, you know how to advocate. I would say things that we can do very specifically is, first and foremost, we should mandate that the A through G college prep coursework is the curriculum for all high school students, no matter what high school you're at. Okay, and since I think that gives students more opportunities to make that transition to college if they so choose to go, but it gives them more opportunities than opposed to getting there to college and not having that. I think also too, we need to look at financial aid, because a lot of students need financial resources when they do get to college. And I think the equity and framework and restructuring of the Pell Grant, second chance Pell is important, but I think also too, taking age limits off of certain levels of financial aid. I believe we just did that in the state of California, but I think the Cal Grant and removing age limitations on financial aid so that students, when they do get to college, it shouldn't be that, because you're 26 or 27, you're no longer eligible for certain amounts of aid. I think we need to do things and put things in place that make the system or make these programs much more equitable and accessible to all. Those are two things I think we can and should try to do. I think it would open more doors to access to more students.
Agreed. Marissa, what are your thoughts? What should we be doing to address education to ensure that Black people are reaching their full potential in San Mateo County? That's such a big question, but we have some great answers thus far, because I think this conversation could continue on for a while. But what comes to mind?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, I know there's this quote that says talent is equally distributed, opportunity or resources are not. And so I'm just thinking, like, if the opportunity was there, if the resources were there, like the possibilities are truly endless. And I think I will say both districts where I work, we've really been leaning into this work. This year, we've talked about the characteristics of white supremacy culture and how to dismantle that, and recognizing that that dismantling will not happen overnight, unfortunately, but we can start to like shake some things up and disrupt some things. So even thinking about something like assessments and how in the society we have this worship of the written word. Well, when we're thinking about assessing students, like some cultures, for example, in the Black culture, we have this rich oral storytelling like piece that's not even tapped into in the classroom. So how can we bring pieces of students' culture into what we're doing? If we're saying that our students are important to us and they matter, well, let's show that. Like, let's bring them into the classroom and meet them where they are instead of trying to get them to come to where we are. So I think taking opportunities to say like, okay, we're swimming in this water. Let's start to recognize, identify it, and figure out how to shake some of these things up. That's what's coming to my mind right now.
Thank you for that. And also, I think, if we could potentially, as a culture, as a modern society, if you will, remove the notion of fear around others inhabiting our space, right? Whether it's in the classroom or it's in our neighborhoods, regardless of where it might be, I think that might open some doors and foster community building in a way that we could tackle some of these additional issues. So just my 2 cents. We're going to move to the Q&A portion. We have some questions already for all of you. People are eager to hear from you and ask their questions. So please, for all who are attending, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat, and I will ask the questions. And then again, at the end of the webinar, you will be able to go back and review the recording and also review additional resources that will be placed on the county's website online. So to start, we have a question that reads, from the Juneteenth educational perspective, based on Marissa's comment about continued discrimination and racism globally, help us understand the connection between education around this issue, balanced with the opposition to critical race theory being introduced into curriculum.
Can you repeat that? Because to me, that seemed really kind of like 2 or 3 different levels. I know the question's not for me, but I mean, that seemed really deep. Can you repeat that?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, Marissa, I know it's for you, but I was like trying to process and follow it.
Well, I think it was based on Marissa's comment. I think anyone can feel free to chime in and offer a response. It reads, from the Juneteenth educational perspective, based on Marissa's comment about continued discrimination and racism globally, help us understand the connection between education around this issue, balanced with the opposition to critical race theory being introduced into curriculum.
I'm happy to start. I think what this gets at the heart of is we as a society are just coming to the opportunity to openly and to celebrate Juneteenth. Many of us didn't even learn about Juneteenth until they got to college, myself included. So the learning of your own history is critical because not only does it help ensure you don't repeat it, but it helps you recognize the importance of inclusivity and to being connected to one another. And when we talk about critical race theory really is being has always been taught more at the graduate student level, because it's really understanding your history and the role that race plays in it. So for me, Juneteenth and CRT is really about raising our level of awareness, about knowing more about who we are and how race has played in our history, both negatively and positively. So it's about raising that level of awareness so that we can recognize and understand what we've done right in our history and what we've done wrong. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, and I would say building on that, with that awareness comes the ability to lean into that criticality piece, and start to explore the way that history might be impacting the present as well. So when I look at this question, which I'm still processing, if I'm being honest, I think that this opposition to CRT is in part to, it's like, okay, how are we going to have this holiday and we get this day off? But then in schools, there are some people who don't want to teach why it's a holiday. So I think that's a way to, I don't know if I'll say ignorance is bliss, but something along those lines, where it's like, if you don't acknowledge the past, you don't have to sit with that discomfort and reckon with what that brings up. Yeah.
And I think I would just add, when people, critical race theory has become this trigger word for people. Obviously, in this country, it's very politicized. But we've actually discussed many things that today that are in our structures. We've talked about Jim Crow, we talked about redlining, we've talked about these things that have been embedded in our structures and our policies that still affect things today. And for me, that's the biggest piece. Like, we have to continue to learn about these things. It just, these weren't one-off, like one racist person over here doing something. These things were policy that were embedded into our society. And so these policies, like redlining, still have significant. Whoops, somehow it muted. But anyway, these policies still have significant impacts on today. And so whether or not you're using the word critical race theory, I think it's still important for us to really educate ourselves around these pieces and the impacts of today so we can address them. We have not brought up the word reparations, but it is a key piece in this that is very important.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, and I've said this before, how you can talk about raising awareness and education around Juneteenth, how you can commemorate Juneteenth, how you can take the day off because Juneteenth is now federal law, and CRT not enter into the conversation. The fact that there's an acknowledgement of Juneteenth at all really bends toward the conversation of critical race theory, which, as Jamila mentioned, at the graduate level is a scholarly practice. I mean, there's critical theory cohorts around many topics, and race is one. So either I'm thinking that perhaps there are some who don't know that and don't understand it. And, again, just would rather continue the rhetoric than educate themselves and form an opinion, maybe. This isn't certainly to politicize this conversation, but I think it's a lot easier to have dialogue with a person that has an opinion and may disagree because of study and research versus just not wanting to talk about it because, to Marissa's point, it feels uncomfortable. We have another question that was adapted from our Facebook Live comment there, and it says, what role does gender play in educational barriers for Black children? I like that question. That's a great question.
What role does gender play in educational equity for Black
Educational
children?
barriers.
Oh, educational barriers. Okay. I would say in my response to that, I find that in the classroom, it seems somehow more often our Black boys tend to have more challenges. The gender of being male and trying to navigate in that space can create a barrier. I think that, if they don't know how to present themselves in a way that makes others feel comfortable, then 9 times out of 10, they are either held back, moved over, or then there's a conversation about, should we do special education without any testing of the individual? So
Mhm.
I think that can create a barrier more for our males in this conversation. That's my understanding.
I think for our females, they're often viewed as much older than they are, so they're treated very differently than they are for their peers. I don't know how we address these things. I think that happens to our males as well, being viewed as much older than, you know, the babies that they are.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was thinking something similar, and for boys, it comes across as threatening, and for girls, it feels like it comes across in terms of like there's this attitude or pushback. And I was thinking about, I think it's called Push Out, the adultification of Black girls in schools by Monique Morris. I think she's based in Oakland. But I'm just thinking again about how that, like, you have to be in the classroom. So if students are getting pushed out, that's a barrier right there. I can recall when I was teaching, seeing students walking around with security officers, and these were kindergarten and first grade students. So it's like, how are they spending their day by walking the halls of the school instead of being in the classroom? So I think statistics often show that it affects Black boys most, but I think girls should also be in that conversation.
I don't see additional questions in either the Q&A or the chat at the moment, but I would like to ask if there are any additional comments that you'd like to make as we begin to wrap up, and, you know, education for all of us that you can share with respect to, you know, something that's going to promote thought for all of us.
I would just add, thank you for that question. And I think I may have seen it somewhere in the chat about increased financial support.
Mhm.
Excuse
That was
me.
a comment. Yes.
I think that not every school district is doing this, but I think that they're moving in that direction. And I think that one of the things that just jumps out at me in my position in higher education is, unfortunately, sometimes I meet students at a point where if they had known 2 months before or 6 months before, the conversation would be so different. And I want to talk about FAFSA. I think that more high school districts need to mandate completion of FAFSA as part of a graduation requirement, and also the California Dream Act application as a requirement for high school graduation, because many of these students and their families may not know that just filling out that application, that document, can open up resources, can open up doors for them. And I think many times students don't find out until either they're past a deadline or trying to address something and not recognizing that they may have missed a critical piece. And so I think sometimes, you know, these are things we should just mandate that everybody do. So I just want to say, we want to talk about really kind of, once again, creating a more equitable level playing field for students in education. But a lot of our students of color and our Black students, they should all know that, you know, you should be doing the FAFSA your senior year of high school. You should be doing the California Dream Act. So that way you can really help support yourself and your family and as many resources as possible as you get ready to go to college.
Mhm. Thank you for that. I think, you know, people who are listening will definitely take that away and be able to either apply it to their families or offer it to someone else, because navigating the resources that are available are definitely a challenge for many. Anything else that we should be thinking about? Key takeaways that you would like to share?
I'm just thinking about how one of the through lines tonight has really been inclusion and belonging, and making sure that we're not falling into the trap of what Zaretta Hammond calls cultural tourism, where we're only talking about it maybe around Juneteenth or during Black History Month. And if we really want students to feel like that they belong in families, I'm speaking for myself, I'm Black 365 days a year, like 366 when it's a leap year. So just thinking, how are we showing up to promote those feelings of belonging for students and families year round?
Okay, we do have a question, thank you, in the Q&A box, and it reads, to create belonging and community in schools, is there an opportunity to consider restorative practices and restorative justice in schools to support kids staying in schools? Deep appreciation for the amazing Black women that are taking the time to offer so much wisdom.
Yes, yes, yes. I would love for restorative practices to be the norm in our schools. Restorative practices, so when you come together, it's a way to have healing and accountability for what has happened. What we find is it does take a lot of resources, so it takes time. Like, you have to have these conversations, you have to set up the conversations. So people are a little resistant just because of kind of the resource intensity that it takes. But I will say, for the schools who implement it with fidelity, they say they don't see kind of repeat behaviors, because students really do learn and grow from these kind of restorative conversations. So I would love to see more restorative practices in our schools. I did attend. It was a very small group of school security officers who were trying to kind of like understand restorative. So it's trying to also get everyone to kind of know what it's about and understand it, and not just have it be just the teacher who's like, conducting the circle, but trying to get the information out there, trying to get folks to know what it's about and why would be so beneficial. So I would love to see it more widespread in our schools.
Can someone quickly give us a definition for those who don't know what restorative practices are? Give us a quick definition of it and how those practices are played out in academic environments.
I don't know that I have a definition offhand, but I can describe. It is when you have a conflict in a school, what you want to do is bring together the perpetrator as well as the victim to have a conversation that is a healing. It's both an accountability conversation, so that the perpetrator knows the harm they've caused, to hear from the person who was victimized, or who was a victim, I should say, and to have a healing, because a lot of times we punish and then everyone just kind of goes off and does their own thing without realizing this is still a community. We still have to be in community with one another. And so the goal is also to help start that healing process in this kind of restorative conversation. But you have to prep, you have an initial conversation with both the parties, and then you bring people together. So that's why I say it is time and resource intensive, but it is beneficial to both parties.
Thank you for that education. Okay, ladies, we are in our final moments here. And again, any parting thoughts or takeaways that you'd like to add before we depart? Well, I think,
I would
sorry,
just
go
say,
ahead.
I just want to remind folks, we're in a pandemic. We've lost a lot of folks. As we move forward, continue just to hold each other up and lead with humility and with grace. This is a very difficult time for our country and for our state. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the conversation tonight. I appreciate all of you offering your wisdom and your expertise to, not only increase the community and only intersection, if you will, for which we have this conversation. So thank you very much for lending your time. We will definitely continue the conversation with San Mateo County Juneteenth 2022 next week. We also have further learning opportunities. Please take a look at your screens here. If you can see this, we have Free the Curls, which is a book authored by Marissa McGee. We have the history of Palo Alto diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. And there's a link there that you can either screenshot or jot down. And again, additional resources will be available on the County Juneteenth webpage. As a reminder, one more time, we have a final webinar that will be next week on June 28th at 7 p.m. Please visit the county webpage to take a look at that and receive the link, where the topic will be with additional thought leaders in San Mateo County around leadership perspectives as it relates to Juneteenth. We want to thank the County of San Mateo for hosting this webinar and offering an environment where we can have open conversations about advancing Black people in San Mateo County and their lived experiences. We thank you all for joining. Have a great night.